Hi, everybody. This is Acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Wednesday, December 11th, and there is a full moon today in the sign of Gemini. So we are going to talk about the full moon in Gemini for today's video blog. There's a lot to say. We're going to talk about, in particular, we're going to talk about what it means that Mercury, who is the dispositor of the full moon right now, is in the sign of Sagittarius, which is the sign of its detriment or exile, classically speaking. And what it means when we have Mercury exiled in the house of Jupiter, Sagittarius. What is the relationship between Mercury and Jupiter, especially when Mercury is debilitated, and how is that affecting this full moon? And what are the themes or symbols you might look for right now in your life? I've got a little passage to read from James Hillman, two of them actually. And hopefully those will be really interesting for you to think about. He has some really nice essays that he wrote on Hermes, who is the original Greek name for Mercury. So we'll be looking at that today. Now, before I dive into that, I just want to remind everybody that we are at 333 backers out of this year's target goal of 420. 419 was last year's record, so we're trying to beat it by one. And we're well on our way. We've got 20 days left in the Kickstarter, and we're less than 100 backers away now. So thank you everybody who has pitched in already. If you haven't yet pitched in, remember that when you do pitch in, you can find the link to my Kickstarter in the comments section and in the video description section of this blog. And when you pitch in, you can pick up a reward reading or other, there's a mantra meditation video I made, teach you how to do mantra meditation, or moon tracking video. There's a variety of different reward readings that you can get, packages you can bundle together for giving as gifts to people. I make all of these readings for you personally. I record a reading just like this to send it to you. My Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic online certification course, which begins in June and November of 2020, is on sale for 50% off. It's $900, typically $1,800. Even my early bird, which is $1,299, this is $400 cheaper then, so really good deal. If you're a student of mine and you want to take my second year program that also begins in June, or my horary class, which also begins in June, those are advanced certification courses that I teach. Those are also all $900. And when you bundle them together, if you get the first year and the second year or all three programs together, the cost also goes down significantly. So I would love to study with some of you. If you're feeling the call to study astrology, you have questions about it, feel free to email me at nightlightastrology@gmail.com, or check out my website, nightlightastrology.com, and go to the certification course tab. I will be doing a video previewing what each class involves and what you learn and things like that. Probably in the next couple of days. There's a bunch of transits to cover this week, but I'll get to that for those of you who've been asking questions about it. So stay tuned for that. You can find out a lot of information about the first year course on my website already if you go there to the certification course tab. Anyway, I'd love to see some of you in class or do a reading for you, and I thank you so much for your support. I can't do this work year in and year out without the support of all of my readers, clients, YouTube folks out there. So I really do thank you for your support. Okay, so that being said, let's tune into this full moon in Gemini. Now, the full moon in Gemini is it's going to happen every year while the sun is in Sagittarius. We know this because any full moon is always exactly opposite the sun. So, if you know where the sun is, you know where the full moon is going to be for the most part. If it's, if the sun is in Capricorn, you're going to have a full moon in Cancer. If it's in Aquarius, you're going to have a full moon in Leo, like that. And so one thing that's kind of cool about the full moon is that when the sun goes down, it's full moon time because the moon will rise immediately after the sun sets. In the east, the moon will just be popping up right away, unless it's cloudy. The full moon every single month represents a moment where it's a moment of differentiation and tension between opposites. There's always opposing or dual forces, archetypally speaking, symbolically speaking, that are opposing one another. And the tension is usually really palpable in some particular area of your life. You can, for example, look at the houses that the full moon falls in, the sun and the moon, and which houses they fall in. The topics of those houses will often be in the spotlight at the time of the full moon, or really for the entire lunar cycle. So that's one way of getting some additional insight out of any full moon, is to look at which house the full moon is falling in. Okay, so that's part one. Part two is to understand the archetypal dichotomy of the planets that rule the signs in which the sun and the moon are falling in during the full moon. Same thing during the new moon. If the new moon was in Sagittarius, this is a Jupiter themed new moon. With Jupiter changing signs, this was a big Jupiter themed moon cycle. And now we're reaching the peak moment of that cycle. In the peak moment, what started off as a seed is now reaching, you could say in the plant analogy that's often used, is reaching the place where it's blossoming. And the fruit is, ripe on the vine, so to speak. It's just about ready to fall off. So that place is full tension from if you're in a yoga class, like if you're reaching all the way up through your hands, rooted down through your feet, you feel the tension from top to bottom. And that's what a full moon is like. There's a sense of tension directing in two opposite directions, your feet grounding in through the floor, your hands reaching up to the heavens, that tension of two things pulling in opposite directions. And we feel this psychologically. We sometimes feel it energetically in our bodies. And sometimes it appears literally in terms of different kinds of opposing viewpoints, ideas, things that are trying to move in opposite directions in some particular area of our life, money or finances, job, relationships, family, etc. Our minds, our beliefs, in school, and so forth. So the way that we start breaking it down from there, and every full moon, is always to look at, well, which planets are represented. It's always the sun and the moon, but then which signs are they in? So the moon is in the temple of Mercury, which is Gemini, also Virgo, but this is the masculine, airy temple of Mercury. And then we have Sagittarius, where the sun is located, which is the fiery masculine sign of Jupiter. So we have a Mercury-Jupiter dynamic. Now, simple next step that you can take is to ask, okay, if the full moon is in Gemini, then I already know that there's going to be, in this case, a Mercury-Jupiter-like tension behind this full moon, behind this time of the lunar cycle. And I might know what that means, in general, and start there. But I can also look very specifically and say, well, where is Mercury and where is Jupiter, and what kind of relationship do they have with each other in the sky right now? So for example, we see Mercury in Sagittarius and Jupiter in Capricorn, and we don't necessarily see a relationship between the two of them aspectually. They're in what we call an aversion to one another. They have no aspectual connection. Now, in ancient astrology, we don't use minor modern aspects like semisextiles and quincunxes and all this kind of thing. Well, I won't get into aspect theory, but suffice to say, in ancient astrology, there's no aspect right now between Mercury and Jupiter. But Mercury is in Jupiter's sign and has no aspectual connection to Jupiter. And Jupiter's sign of Sagittarius happens to be one of the two places where Mercury is said to be in its exile or detriment. That is to say that Mercury is in an environment that is not conducive to Mercury's own significations, because Mercury is in the sign opposite to its own and in the home of a planet that is its natural contrary. So what we have to do then is, in this case, is say, okay, this is a full moon, and the full moon in Gemini is opposite to its own host, Mercury, who is debilitated in the opposite sign of Sagittarius. So this is a mercurial full moon with a debilitated Mercury, with a Mercury that is opposed to the moon. It would be like if I went to your house and I was a guest in your house, and somehow, we were opposed to one another within the house, intellectually, mentally, physically, whatever, emotionally. So first of all, the moon and Mercury are not necessarily getting along right now. Not only that, but Mercury, the host, is in a bad way. It would be like if I went over to your house, we were hanging out, and typically as my host, you should make me a sandwich, I don't know what, and make sure that my needs are being taken care of. Not only are you opposed to me, but also maybe you've got a really bad stomach bug or something. Maybe you're sick, or maybe you're hungover or something like that. That makes it even more tricky. Simple analogy, but the point is that to simply get the feeling for the full moon. Okay, this is a moon in Gemini in Mercury's sign. It's opposed to Mercury, and Mercury's debilitated. So we're dealing with some of the quintessential challenges of Mercury during this full moon, and we have to understand what those challenges are archetypally. Why do Mercury and Jupiter sometimes not get along? So that's what we're going to look at next. And in order to do that, excuse me, I'm going to read you a few passages. Now, first of all, I'm going to read you something from a wonderful, one of my favorite books by James Hillman, which is called Healing Fiction. If you've never read this book, it's fantastic. You have to kind of be into, it's a little bit more philosophical, and it's a book about psychology, and it's a book about the way in which when we're in therapy with someone, or we're doing something that's therapeutic, we are often crafting sort of imaginative stories that help feed the life of the soul. And it's a book about the storytelling that happens in therapy. It's a really, really great book. Anyway, there's a particular section in this book where Hillman starts talking about Mercury and Mercury's relationship to a few different things. And one of them is storytelling, and another one is a figure that is called the daimon. And the daimon is sort of like a sort of mercurial in a sense, because daimons are like spiritual guides. They're spirits, but they are they're somewhere in between, you know, like a god and us, and they're like intermediate figures. So at any rate, here's something that Hillman writes about daimons. What is it which distinguishes daimons from the visible and invisible gods? His attempts to capture in descriptions and present in an ordered hierarchy the imaginal persons and their effects is comparable in our days with the attempts at precise descriptions of psychic events, such as we find among introspectionists, phenomenologists, and asylum psychiatrists. To the intellect, the daimons seem to appear as a pandemonium, and the intellect's reaction is to attempt an intellectual diacrisis, discernment, or differentiation. Jung's conversation with the images was a psychological diacrisis, giving them the opportunity to present their own logos. And nota bene, they did not appear to him as a pandemonium, but as distinct, discernible figures with names. So first of all, one of the things that he's mentioning here is the way in which, when seemingly random ideas, thoughts, and images come into our sphere, our mind, our body, our intuition, etc., our dreams, one of the things that we naturally do, because we're uncomfortable with the chaos that often comes with random thoughts, ideas, figures, dreams, images, sounds, you know, all the kind of random psychic stuff that has a way of coming in, is that we try to contextualize it, and we try to give it name, we try to differentiate it, we try to give it a place within the larger whole, or the larger a larger sense of order. So, for example, even in Christian stories, one of the known facts about exorcism that even Jesus talks about is the naming of a demon being essential to pulling the demon out of someone's body or mind. One of the things that often goes along, and I'm just using these as analogies, one of the things that goes along with Mercury and Jupiter is that Mercury is oftentimes seen as the chaotic pandemonium of thoughts and ideas and images and intuitive hits and random words that come tumbling out of your mouth, and that there's a kind of pandemonium or chaotic everywhere-ness about Mercury. And what role does Zeus-Jupiter play? Zeus-Jupiter often plays the role of trying to name those forces or figures, relate them to someone like Hermes, and then put them into the context of a greater moral cosmic order or unity. So the role often that these two play is, here's Mercury, like all over, thoughts, ideas, experiences that go in every which way, that are very flexible, fluid, fast, different, diverse, many. And then, of course, Zeus-Jupiter comes in, and the tension is always to say, look, if this runs amok, then it starts to disable the larger order that we need to stay sane, or that we need in order to make sure that we are not just kind of there's not just sort of undifferentiated madness. So that's part of the tension of Mercury and Zeus. So here we go. Find it. How do the sudden events attributed to daimons, as well as the images of our interior life, fit within the wider embrace of planetary cosmic principles, the gods or archetypes? Proclus resolved this by stating that about every god there is an innumerable multitude of daimons who have the same appellations with their leaders, because they express in themselves the characteristic peculiarity of their leading god. Implied is that the little daimons of our complexes, symptoms, and fantasies are in the preceding train of the major divinities that they express, say Apollonic, martial, Venusian qualities, etc. So what Hillman is explaining here is the way that the psyche tends to take the chaotic randomness of our experiences, our inner psychic experiences, and will try to bring them into a larger coherence. And one of the ways that this was done philosophically by the ancient Greeks, and he quotes was again Proclus, is to say that what appear like these random things that are flitting about our life all the time, coming and going, the random thing you meet on the street or while you're walking, or the random thought that comes up, the random dream image that flashes, the daydream idea that appears out of nowhere, that these things are, instead of saying that they're just random, the daimons, the little fleeting spirits, they are given to, it becomes important to be able to identify them with gods that they belong to or that they are related to. Why? Because then the gods become placeholders in the greater order of the cosmos, which is the greater unity, you could say, of the psyche. So this is all Mercury Zeus stuff. This is Hermes, Zeus, or Mercury, Jupiter, I should say. Let's read a little bit more. So then he starts talking about active imagination. This is something that Jung talked about, which is a way of, when Jung, in his Red Book, when Jung started getting to know the inner images, voices, and so forth, he got their names, and then they became characters, and they took on more, they started to cohere into the sense of kind of a unified inner cosmos, you could say. So in active imagination, he says a few things about what active imagination is and isn't. Active imagination is not a spiritual discipline, not a way of Ignatius or Loyola or of Eastern yoga, for there are no prescribed or proscribed fantasies. One works with whatever images arise, not special ones chosen by a master or a code. This is important. Hillman is not huge on yoga, and I personally have some disagreements with him on this particular point. But the good thing that he's talking about, and really what I take his meaning, given the range of other things he's written as well, is that we have to honor the things that come up in us. Like if an owl comes up and it has real importance in your psyche, an owl may have nothing to do with yoga, right? As in terms of the kind of canon of familiar images in yoga. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't work with it. And on that point with him, I very much agree. So first of all, active imagination means that we are working with whatever arises, whatever comes our way, whatever appears unexpectedly. And that's very Hermetic. That's Hermes. That's the unexpectedness of the Hermetic experience, the thought or the random thing that appears. And whatever it is, that's the substance that we're here to work with on some level. He says active imagination is not an artistic endeavor, not a creative production of paintings and poems. One may aesthetically give form to the images. Indeed, one should try as best one can aesthetically, though this is for the sake of the figures, in dedication to them, and to realize their beauty, and not for the sake of art. The aesthetic work of active imagination is therefore not to be confused with art for exhibition or publication. In other words, what he's saying here is that the stuff that comes up in our life, the random things that appear, he wants us to show devotion to them. He wants us to love them. He doesn't want us to arrest some meaning from them. He doesn't want us to try to place them into the agenda of some kind of goal, but instead, what rises up in our psyche naturally, he is saying that we are to become dear to, and we're to endear them to ourselves and them to us. Active imagination aims not at silence, but at speech, not at stillness, but at story or theater or conversation. It emphasizes the importance of the word, not the cancellation of the word, and thus the word becomes a way of relating, an instrument of feeling. So again, Hillman, very much a Bhakta in this regard, is saying, it's not like ultimately when we're talking about developing a relationship with our own soul, we want to develop a relationship with whatever the raw substance is that's appearing. Again, and this is not about, so it's not about silencing the mind. It's not about emptying out, stilling, getting quiet, eliminating any thoughts, ideas, concepts, images, figures, but rather it's about, again, dialogue and relationship. Now, this is really important because what he's doing is he's honoring Hermes. Every little thing that he's doing right here is honoring Hermes, Mercury, who comes into our life as the escort of the soul. How is it that our soul actually evolves? People throw this word around all the time, evolves. But if by evolve we mean that we become better, like morally, or become wiser intellectually, or become more accomplished, or if it's a checklist of things that have some objective measurable result, that's not the kind of soul making that Hillman's talking about. Soul making has to do with the development of relationships between living beings. That's the measure of how your soul is evolving, is how much are you loving? How much are you in relationship with the attentiveness and the presence that's required of relationships if it's to grow into love. But he's talking about this on the level of our own soul and the raw material that's coming up within us. Thus, it is not a mystical activity performed for the sake of illumination, for reaching select states of consciousness. That would be imposing an intention upon a psychological activity. That would be a domination of, even a repression of soul by spirit. This is another very important point, and very much in line again with Bhakti Yoga, where we say it's not about trying to attain anything, any state of consciousness or anything like that. No, again, he's saying this isn't a mystical activity, it's a relationship building activity. And if relationship gets co-opted by intention and agenda, it kills what the soul really wants, which is love. Love for whatever is naturally arising. I see this in my daughter all the time. Like, we'll be outside, and if you're a parent, you probably know this. If you've ever worked with kids, you know this. When children take an interest in something, it is as though entire chambers of their heart, soul, and mind are opened in relation to whatever object suddenly, seizes their interest. A rock, a shining something, as you're walking down a path when we go walk the dog, something always catches my daughter's eye. And what I see opening up in her is an honoring of the ontology, the beingness of whatever it is that she perceives. She doesn't want to apprehend it, dissect it, figure it out, understand it, assimilate it, and prop herself up as smarter. Do you know what I mean? Or prop herself up as somehow bigger because she now has apprehended or arrested that thing's meaning. She doesn't want to achieve something. She's drawn into an orbit of relational interest and curiosity with what she sees. That's the evidence of the soul. That's the evidence of a being who is interested in beingness and other beings. And the motivating, the real discovery that's always happening on that level, if we continue with it and remain open, is love. So he goes on. Active imagination is not a psychological activity in the transpersonal sense of theurgy, ritual magic, the attempt to work with images by and for the human will. From both sides of archetypal psychology's tradition, Plotinus and Freud, we've been warned against opening floodgates to the black tide of mud occultism. Active imagination becomes Popularists' superstitious theurgy. When we activate the images artificially, drugs, perform it routinely as ritualism, foster special effects, synchronicities, further divinatory abilities, turning to inner voices to interpret dreams, using it to augment self-confidence in decisions, personal power. Each and all of these uses are no longer modes of self-knowledge, but of self-aggrandizement, now covered by the innocent label psychic growth. The other thing that he really doesn't like, and I have to agree with him, is that when we take the cacophony of psychic energies coming around us, and rather than being interested, curious, and cultivating some devotional connection to the things arising within us and around us, and instead we say, how can I use these images to worship them and get something, to put them up on a placard, chant, and then get a result, right? Or to use them in order to in decode, interpret their meaning, and then get something out of that. Like, oh, there's a dream. What does it mean? What does it mean for me? What is it telling me? Me, right? Or to augment self-confidence and decisions. Well, my owl spirit came and I know that I'm an owl person and I have this special greatness. Look at, I mean, so again, I just go back to this, like, look at the way that a child interacts with something that they find in nature that they're curious about. They respect it as an autonomous being with autonomous reality, even if it's an imaginal object, like that doesn't seem to have, you know, a normal, like, consciousness, like an animal, like a stick, you know what I mean? Or a stick that's laying in a peculiar way, or whatever. The idea is that by recognizing the agency and beingness of other beings, that we don't try in psychic life when things are appearing, we don't try to take them in, integrate them, as we always say, and turn them into something for me. Instead, we're turned toward the other as a reality that we want to know, that we want to love, that we want to foster a friendship with, or conversation with, a relationship with, a dialogue with. This is Mercury at its best. Mercury at its worst is the one, when Mercury is in its detriment in Jupiter's sign, who is always wanting to take that thing, the natural arisings, and relate it back to the personal agenda that keeps my cosmos feeling like it's nice and centered around me and my ego. That's when Mercury is in its detriment. When Mercury is in its detriment, all thoughts, random ideas, and so forth are co-opted into the larger plan or vision. Sometimes that's not bad. That can be a way of taking data and bringing it in order to see the larger coherent picture. Data confirms the belief. Data confirms the hypothesis. But it's also bias in that sense. It has the potential to be about the bias of the ego. So rather than getting to know the things that are naturally arising, relating to them and developing relationships, we tend to try to co-opt them back into, well, what do I want? How is this image going to now become a totem that I worship? And, hopefully it gets me things like greater mojo, greater confidence, better money, more clients, manifestation, all that kind of stuff, right? Now, so Hillman tells us right here, again, active imagination, working with whatever arises, is not about the attempt to work the images for the sake of a larger plan that's about your will and your personal way. That would just be as bad as if you've ever been out on a date with somebody, and while you're out on a date with somebody, you get the sense that they want to marry you on the first date because they have a picture of married life and a happy little plan that they're playing out, and you check a few boxes or enough to be like, fitting into their idealized portrait, and you get that feeling. You're like, oh boy, they don't even know me. You know what I mean? I'm just fitting into their grand plan. So similarly, when Mercury is in its detriment, during the full moon in Mercury sign with Mercury in its detriment, we have to be very careful that we're not sort of taking the things around us and instead of engaging with them from the heart in relationship, staying open, staying vulnerable, allowing them to have their own separate reality, that we are not trying to co-opt them for our own larger purposes. So that's something we have to be very careful of. Therefore, active imagination, so close to art and procedure, is distinct from it in aim. This is not only because active imagination foregoes an end result in a physical product, but more because its intention is to know thyself, self-understanding, which is as well its limit. the paradoxical limit of endlessness that corresponds with the Heraclitean endlessness of Psyche itself. Wow, that's freaking beautiful. Let's read this one last sentence. Know thyself is its own end and has no end. It is mercurial. It is a paradoxical hermetic art that is both goal-directed and without end. Getting to know yourself, according to Hermes, when Hermes has a good, healthy, relationship with Jupiter, and the two are working, it goes like this. What is the larger, all-encompassing belief? It is that through our relationships with one another, through honest, loving relationships with one another, the potential to understand who we are as individuals is endless. Just like the potential and capacity to love one another is endless. So the more that we love one another, the more that we come to know ourselves. And the more that we know ourselves, the more that we are compelled to love one another. This is the union between Zeus and Hermes in the intellectual sense. The dogma, the bigger cosmic picture, is one of relation and love. Relation to ourselves, knowing the God that dwells within, and knowing others and the God that dwells within. Know thyself is endless, but it's endless because it is facilitated by the endless variety and organic newness of relationships. If we're not in relationship with the things around us, then what happens is the all-consuming purpose tends to be that of the moral and spiritual vision of the ego, which is about self-interest, and then relationships get shut down, and know thyself is confused with one's personal will. When knowing thyself is equated to one's personal will, all relationships are co-opted by the will. And that happens, you could say that is one of the things that happens when Mercury is in Zeus's sign. The mind has a tendency to interpret everything around it in terms of its own little paradigm of self-interest. So we have to be very careful about that right now. And remember that it's okay to be wrong. When we are wrong, we allow for the possibility to know something different and to know someone different, to know ourselves differently. Knowing ourselves differently and knowing someone else differently enhances love if that's our main goal. If it's not our main goal, then it's threatening, right? So to be very careful of that. Okay, now, on the other hand, there's one other issue with Hermes that we have to be really careful of, and that is the addiction to information. Because the opposite is also true. We've been speaking right now in favor of the pandemonium of Mercury, the plethora of fleeting daimons and images of Mercury, and how to find place for them in relationship with one another and with the things that are naturally occurring in the psyche to develop love and interest and curiosity. That's kind of putting Mercury in the right space. Now, what about there's another problem with Mercury, though, that can come up. Let's read from an essay called Hermetic Intoxication by James Hillman. This is from a collection of essays called Mythic Figures that he wrote. Globalism feels like an overdose of Hermes, just as the age of reason suffered from an overdose of Apollonic sunlight and an excess of the normalizing rationality of Minerva. So first of all, he's saying the age of reason is sort of like the sun. And right now we're kind of in an age of Hermes, Mercury. As the century turns, a monotheism of Hermes holds us in thrall. Not only his new instrumentarium, but the acceleration with which each new generation of these tools and devices is developed. Obsolescence within 8 months, each device surpassed by increasingly expanding improvements, ever wider reach, ever quicker connections. A second area where Hermes rules is the marketplace, the stock marketplace. Mutual funds, speculation, currencies, commodities, futures, options, derivatives, hedges. The markets of the world connect today by instantaneous communications, allowing for giant shifts of money from one place to another, one currency to another, one market to another. What once was chronic long-term investment is now quick hermetic turnover. The market is a game, as we say, playing the market. These giant shifts of money are shadowed by giant scams and thefts, by laundering and deception. Accounting systems can no longer keep up with the fast moves of the bankers who handle millions and billions of dollars per transaction. Governments cannot control the multinational corporations or govern the fluctuations of currency, the price of gold and basic commodities, or the value and amount of their own money supply. Once Saturn ruled the money. In the old books of symbolism, Saturn was called a money bags. He was depicted with a tightly closed purse and declared god of the mint. Now, with its hypertrophy of Hermes, money is no longer solid coin or backed by gold, only words and numbers, mere messages sent by electronic data processing and represented by a little oblong of embossed plastic. In many places where hermetic finance has reached its apogee, the fundamental importance of home and land have fallen to hermetic intoxication. The earth and its buildings that give stability and shelter find their value determined by speculative development and mortgage rates. Hermes, who himself has no resting place or permanent abode on earth, has brought his impermanence and quick turnovers of value directly into our human habitations. One aspect of hermetic intoxication deserves special psychological attention. I refer now to the appetite for information. If you recall, Hermes was the messenger of the gods and an indiscriminate messenger. This because he carried all messages without actively entering into the content of what he carried. He had no opinions, values. He made no editorial comments. He did not censor. His task was to make communication possible, even communication with the realm of the dead and the world below. Information takes no positions, carries no grudges, and thus has no limits. In a culture that has lost the gods, a culture from which the gods have withdrawn, we have the messages, but they do not carry the gods' meanings. Mere information. Yet Hermes, in his dutiful faithfulness to his archetypal role, passes on the information, indiscriminately facilitating the messages regardless of their content, which may as easily be a blog, a joke, an ad, a sexual come-on, or a revelation of crucial political significance. The word information itself has become so inflated that it carries the code of an individual's DNA, identity, and destiny. Not wisdom, not knowledge, not inspiration, not learning, not comfort, not truth, not prophecy, not moral value or aesthetic beauty. Instead of messenger of the gods, Hermes has become servant of the internet. Great section, right? Really beautiful. But there's what Mercury looks like debilitated as well. Mercury without a center. Mercury without having some greater message to bear than just the transient fleetingness of stuff. How can we see this on display? This debilitated Mercury right now under this full moon can look like this. Someone who is scattered everywhere and every which way in every direction, and it's getting on your nerves. Maybe it's your own self. Because there is no moral center, there is no spiritual center, or even the environment is chaotic, untidy, lacking a sense of cohesion and greater purpose for which the streams of diverse phenomenon cohere to. See, Mercury as the messenger was always related back to the gods, just like we say that the impulse is to associate daimons with Hermes or with messengers and greater gods so that they're not just a complete chaos. Chaos and order have to have a relationship with one another. That's the point. And if our lives are just streams of information, chaotic everywhere, then we're often what's going to happen is we're going to be guilty of hypocrisy in some big way when Mercury is in its detriment. We're going to say one thing and mean something completely different, or we're going to, take a stand for one thing while not morally evaluating ourselves first, or even worse, we're going to feign as though we have commitments and beliefs when actually the bottom line is that we're taking anything we get and just plugging it into very base level desires and selfish interest. And we're doing that because we don't have a greater sense of how the different elements or aspects of our lives fit together into a vision or a set of commitments. Jupiter, Zeus, after all, is the sense of larger moral cosmic order. We need that, right? Okay, it can go in the opposite direction, where that sense of everything being about one thing can then co-opt all of the multiplicity of things and deny them autonomy, can strip them of their own individual diverse identities. Just like globalism can kill culture, even though there's good things about globalism, for example, technology moving into other parts of the world, medicine moving into other parts of the world, better human rights, et cetera, et cetera. But the downside can also be that it kills cultural diversity, right? So you have the same kind of dynamic within the psyche. If we aren't treating everything that arises in us, like giving it unique agency and developing relationships with it, if we're just co-opting it into some great personal egoic agenda, then Zeus is dominating Mercury in not such a good way. On the other hand, if there's just a complete abundance of information, a complete chaos around us of stuff, and it's not being brought together on behalf of a larger sense of order and purpose in life, spiritually, morally, philosophically, relationally, professionally, whatever, we're also in trouble, because there's nothing that in some ways strips us of our sanity more than living with too many things happening, too much stimulation, and really no idea why we're doing or saying or thinking or entertaining any of the things that we are. It'll just, it short circuits us eventually. So the tension between Mercury and Zeus, Mercury and Jupiter, can go in either direction right now, but you will feel it in some area of your life. The need, for example, to clean up the chaos, to make the particulars of the environment cohere with a larger vision for your life. That's important right now. Pay attention to that. At the same time, be careful of trying to deny or kind of eliminate important differences in diversity because you're trying to streamline everything too quickly, impatiently, or for some personal gain. Here's a really simple way that this happens. Have you ever gone on a diet before? Like, let's say you go on a cleanse and you lose some weight, and then you go to the gym for a few weeks in a row and you lose some weight, and you're feeling a little bit better about yourself, and so you look at your closet and you look and you go like, yeah, I'm above all of this stuff now, and so you get rid of all of it. Do you know what I mean? Like, I'm just going to buy a whole new wardrobe or something like that. I'm going to get rid of all of these things. They represent the old me, right? And then you think to yourself, or maybe you think like, I'm going to go minimalist. And so you get rid of like everything you own and just, you have like one item on every, surface in your house or something. And I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with this, but if this is done impatiently, because you're trying to eliminate as much diversity as possible in order to get it all streamlined into just one thing, the many will revolt. And that sense of the moral order you're trying to impose on the world around you will not last very long. You'll swing back pretty much. You'll gain the weight back pretty soon. The clutter will be back, whatever, because the many needs space. On the other hand, there's a reason that people go on diets and that people, purge their belongings and things like that, because we know that the many can overwhelm us, and we need some way of making the environment clear and clean so that we stay home with our spiritual intentions for our lifetime. So it's quite a balance to strike right now, and it's one that's especially tense because, again, we have full moon in Mercury's sign opposite Mercury, who's debilitated in Zeus's sign. So watch for this tension. Tell me your stories. I'd love to hear from you guys. How are you seeing or witnessing this tension right now in your life? Maybe it's something really simple. Maybe it's something bigger. You could also see this happening in relationships where key philosophical differences are happening, or where people are wanting you to sort of fit into their plan, or they're not letting you be yourself, or vice versa. It can show up in work with different kinds of philosophical tensions about different visions that people have and how everything should cohere to one grand plan and so forth. One thing that helps me is this. I think about a widely discussed philosophical concept in yoga, which is the importance of, there's three modes of material nature, the gunas. There's sattva gun, rajagun, and tamas. Goodness, passion, and ignorance. Now, when you have passion, right, it's kind of like there's a lot of activity going on, and it's very geared toward the results that you're trying to get by means of your activity. In ignorance, it's more like people who are being moved along through life really unconsciously with a lot of ignorance. And with goodness is not the point of life, but goodness is conducive to the I was talking to my spiritual teacher about this recently. Goodness is conducive to cultivating love. goodness is where there is a certain sense of order in your environment, but there's also diversity. So, for example, a simple way to practice the marriage of Mercury and Jupiter is perhaps to keep a space in your home where if you have a home altar, or you pray, or you offer things, to keep that space in your house always really clean, so that at least one place that you come back to every day where you can enter into your soul making, your active imagination, where you are working with the material of your life, but you're doing so and you're returning to that space that's clean and fresh, and it offers you the coherence. So that you bring in with you to that space all the diversity of your life, but it helps you bring it back into a unified whole as well. Even if you can't keep the chaos of your home, for example, in total order, because it's really hard, especially if you have kids, God. Even if you just have one room that has the sense of really needing to be nice and clean, you burn incense, you keep it really spotless, you have flowers in there, whatever the case is, even that can help if you struggle on the chaos end. On the other hand, if you struggle on the everything needs to be totally ordered end, a sattvic environment that's too tight, that's too rigid, oftentimes you're not going to be able to enjoy it. Like, if you've ever been to someone's house that's spotless, but you don't feel like you can sit down. So you want to try to make sure that your attempt to control and keep the environment like clean and unified isn't so strong that it doesn't allow for some relaxation and playfulness of the energies in the space around you. All right, I'm not going to pretend like I can give great advice about this stuff anymore. So hopefully this helps. I would love to hear your stories. Again, it's like 333 backers. So if you haven't backed my campaign yet, I would love your support. If you appreciate these videos, you like them, you share them, I appreciate that too. And yeah, I'd like to hear how this full moon goes for everybody. We'll be back again pretty soon because Venus is about to conjoin Pluto as well, which is a whole nother transit to talk about. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye.